And for those of you that come often to the History Club, you probably realise that I'm the other half of Chris Grier, who's already spoken to the club many times. So the last time that my husband spoke to the club, he spoke about social unrest in North Wales. And he looked across the whole of North Wales for incidents of social unrest, and he looked across many centuries. I hope you can all hear me, can you? Yeah? Let me know if you can't. But tonight I'm going to do something different, and I'm going to look at one incident of social unrest on one particular evening, and it was the January the 31st, 1879, in one particular place, and it was Rhuddlan, and it was actually the High Street in Rhuddlan. So, without further ado, can we have the first slide, please? I think it'll go down 2, won't it, because it inserted one. That's it. So if you had opened your newspapers in February 1879, your local paper headline would have said, "Rioters' conduct and cowardly assault by a mob." And this is what happened on that January evening in the High Street. So on that January evening, a mob or a crowd of 80 to 100, mainly men, gathered outside a meeting that had been held in Rhuddlan. And as the speakers left the meeting at about 9 o'clock, they were followed. One of the speakers, a Mr. J. Stanley, was punched and hit with sticks. There were shouts of "murder, murder," as Mr. Robert Henry Jones, the county court bailiff, was knocked unconscious and left for dead in a ditch near the Black Inn, which became the King's Head. So later in court, the incident was described as a serious riot, which occurred at Rhuddlan the other day. The crowd hooted and yelled and caused the peaceable, indisposed inhabitants of the parish to be in terror and fear of their lives. So, what could have induced the good people of Rhuddlan to be up in arms to such an extent that they were fighting in the streets? So if we go on to the next slide, please.
Oh, wrong one again.
So just as a bit of context, 1879, we had Disraeli, Tory Prime Minister, in office. It was his second administration, and from 1880 he was replaced by the Liberal Gladstone. So what was going on at that time in the world? There was trouble in Bosnia as Britain propped up the Ottoman Empire against Russia. Now when I put the talk together, I never dreamed it would be that contemporary, so nothing changes, does it? We'd not long had the Congress of Berlin, which redrew the map of the Balkans following the Russian-Turkish War. And closer to home within this country, the growing labour movement, trade unions had been decriminalised in 1875. So that was quite contemporary to our riot. So trade unions were recognised from then onwards under the Employers and Workmen Act. So was it any of these international or trade union concerns that the people of Rhuddlan were in the streets for? No, it wasn't. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is a picture of a soup kitchen in Sheffield in 1878. So across the country, and Wales was no different, it was a time of hardship. Indeed, the local vicar here opened a soup kitchen in 1881. So this period, it was a time of it was an agricultural depression. The potato crop failed in 1877. There was fungal diseases of the crops in 1879 and an outbreak of pneumonia of cattle and sheep. So again, a time of hardship here as elsewhere. So was it for those reasons that the good people of Rhuddlan were out on the streets fighting? No, it wasn't. Can I have the next slide, please? So, the main employment in Rhuddlan would have been, at that time, agriculture. And of course, we've got the Phoenix Ironworks down by the river, which at this time was employing around about 130 men. But the Phoenix Ironworks made predominantly agricultural farm equipment. So if there's a depression in agriculture, there's no money to invest in new farm equipment. So was it fears of job losses that brought the people out? No, it wasn't. It wasn't economic, it wasn't labour unrest, and it wasn't political, at least not on a national level. The reason that they were fighting in the streets of Rhuddlan on the 31st of January, that 1879, was, and I'll ask for the next slide, to quote Mr. Blair, education, education, education.
Sounds like Tony Blair.
And what the good people of Rhuddlan wanted was a new school. And they felt so strongly about it that they came to blows in the High Street. So I think at this stage I'll just do a very brief summary of the state of education up until 1870. So if I can have the next slide, please. So prior to about 1800, the main educational provision across the country would have been the grammar schools, which were often set up way back after the Reformation. So some of them were very ancient. And then you had the independent or adventure schools, which were schools set up for profit, often quite, variable in size, but mainly, as I say, for profit. Then you have the charity or ragged schools for the poor and Sunday schools. And you can imagine that the quality of education varied enormously across those different types of schools. So in 1811, the National Society for Promoting the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Established Church in England and Wales was established. And they set about raising funds and building schools. And they were very firmly linked to the Anglican Church. And so the schools that they built became known as national schools. Now, the other side of the religious coin, in 1808, the Protestant non-conformist, non-denominational or British schools were founded by the Society for Promoting the Lancastrian System for the Education of the Poor, which is a bit of a mouthful. And in 1814, they changed their name to the British and Foreign School Society. So the non-conformist schools became known as British schools, and the Anglican schools became known as the national schools. So there's two systems, but they're both set up to promote the education of the poor. And they both use this Lancastrian system, or sometimes it was known as the monitorial system. So Joseph Lancaster, who started the system, his motto was, "He who teaches learns." So you would have one teacher who would teach the older and more able children very basic facts and figures, and they'd learn by rote. And then they would be sent off to teach the younger and less able children. So you would have one teacher in charge of an enormous class of children, and they would be learning very basic things, very basic level of education. Both the British and the national schools use this system, And they had some success in bringing some elementary education to the masses. So it's thought that in 1816, round about 58% of children had some form of elementary education. And this had risen by 1835 to 83%. But the average attendance at these schools was for 1 year. Now you can imagine, what can you instill into a child in 1 year under the monitorial system? It would be very basic. And just by way of background, as I say here, the non-conformists, the British schools, were organised by Joseph Fox, William Allen and Samuel Whitbread. So Fox was a dental surgeon and a philanthropist. William Allen was a scientist, a philanthropist and an anti-slavery abolitionist. And Samuel Whitbread, as far as I can tell, was a politician. I don't think he was linked to the brewery firm, as far as I know, which would be a bit odd seeing as he's with the non-conformists. So we've talked about the two different societies. Add into that mix, in 1847, we have the Education Report, or known as the Blue Books. And 1847, English-speaking Anglican inspectors were sent into Wales to look at the state of education in Wales. And they were very partisan. They didn't have any understanding or sympathy for the Welsh language or the Welsh culture. And they came to some very damning conclusions about the state of education. But they were extremely partial, and as Professor Morgan has written about this report, and he referred to the significance of the Blue Books and the consequences of their report as the Glencoe and Amritsar of Welsh history. So very strong. So next slide, please. So obviously this is the National School in Rhuddlan that we all know, and I think it's the 1820s that this was built, isn't it? Can't quite remember the exact date, but this is the National School. And this is where the meeting was held on the 31st of January. So this is where they were. So next slide, please. This is a British school, so built by the non-conformist side of the equation, and that's built in the 1840s. This is in Denbighshire. Anybody know where it is? Anybody recognise that building? It's not Denby.
Holywell?
No, it's Llangollen. It's quite a nice illustration of a British school. So, next slide, please. So this is a cartoon from Punch in 1870. And the caption says, "The 3 R's, or better late than never." And he's saying, this is Mr. Forster, he's saying, "Well, my little people, we have been gravely and earnestly considering whether you may learn to read. I am happy to tell you that, subject to a variety of restrictions, conscience clauses, and the consent of your vestries, you may." Now, Forster brought in the 1870 Education Act. He was a Liberal politician, or at least in some aspects he was Liberal. He was also known as Buckshot Forster because of his support of lethal force in Ireland against the Irish Land League, but that's another story. For our purposes, we're looking at the Education Act. So, The Education Act was the first piece of legislation to deal specifically with the provision of education. Up until this point, the state didn't interfere in education. It wasn't thought to be proper. It was the realm of the private parents' responsibility, and the state should stay out of it. So this is the first time that the state gets involved in education. Next slide, please. So it, okay. So it demonstrates the commitment by the state to provide education on a national scale. Now, the Act allowed the voluntary schools to carry on unchanged, but established a system of school boards to build and manage schools in areas where they were needed. So if there was a lack of provision somewhere, the local people could ask for a school board to be set up. The boards were locally elected bodies, and they drew their funding, and this is quite key, they were funded by the local rates. So unlike voluntary schools, religious teaching in the board schools was to be non-denominational. So the school boards, where they were established, were comprised of members elected to the board by the ratepayers, and women were allowed to stand for election to the school boards, which, when you think at this time women didn't have the vote, is quite something. And down in Merthyr Tydfil, Rose Crawshay, who was the ironmaster's wife, was the first woman to be elected onto a school board, and she sat on two. She sat on the Merthyr Tydfil school board and the Vinyl school board, which is quite something. So the thing that I find odd is where there was a school board, attendance at school could be compulsory if the school board passed a bylaw, but they didn't have to. So I struggle with the idea that compulsory attendance was voluntary if they wished it to be. Also, parents had to pay for their children to go to school. This wasn't free education, so if there was a bylaw that compelled attendance, there was a double whammy for the parents, if you like. The children had to go to school, and the parents had to pay for the privilege, and they would lose the economic benefits of their child's domestic or waged labour. So it was difficult for some. So next slide, please. So this is talking about the habit of schooling. Okay, I won't expect you to read it, it's quite little print, but I'll read it out to you. So in areas where the school boards enforce compulsory attendance, as I say, the parents could feel aggrieved by having to pay for the child to attend and losing the child's wages. As the school logbook for one London school recorded in 1873, it seemed almost impossible to induce the parents to send their girls regularly. They're kept at home for everything. And at one Deptford school, even as late as the turn of the century, when school attendance was universally compulsory, a widow washerwoman would regularly call through the classroom window to her 8-year-old, "Come on out, Lizzie, I need you," and the teacher would let her go. It was very hard to enforce it. And indeed, we still have a school term that gives us 6 weeks summer holiday so the children can help get the harvest in. So we're still in that mindset in many ways. But this is the next passage, I'll read it out. This is from Philip Snowden's autobiography. Now, Philip Snowden was born in 1864. He died in 1937. And in 1924, he became the first Labour Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he held that post again in 1929. He grew up in Yorkshire, and he records his gratitude for the 1870 Forster Education Act. After the passing of Mr. Forster's Education Act, a few progressive persons in the village started an agitation for the adoption of the Act. The Act was adopted, and the school I attended was taken over by the newly formed school board. Steps were taken at once to build new school premises. A trained master was appointed, and a new era in child education in the village was opened up. I was between 10 and 11 years old when this change took place, so that would have been 1874-75. It brought me into a new world of learning. We were taught in a new schoolroom, which by comparison with the dingy old place we left, seemed like a palace to us. The walls were covered with maps and pictures. Our curriculum was extended to include grammar, geography, history, elementary mathematics, and the simple sciences. We were not troubled by the religious question, for in order to avoid all controversy, the board from the beginning banished the Bible from the school, not because they were irreligious, but because they believed that the teaching of religion was best carried out in sects in their own Sunday schools. So that's quite a tribute to the change that the 1870 Act could make. And that's what the good people of Rhuddlan wanted too, or some of them. So next slide, please. So this, as you're all aware, is Lloyd George. Lloyd George was born in 1863, and he attended his local school, which was a national school, i.e. Anglican. The Welsh language at his school was not recognised, and 80% of his fellow pupils were non-conformist, but they had to observe the rites and respect the rituals of the Anglican Church. So, on the 6th of May 1878, the local gentry and the school inspector, a Reverend Watts, came to his school to watch the prize giving. And Lloyd George won the Scripture Prize that year, and they watched him gain his school prize. And then the schoolmaster signalled for all the boys to stand up and to recite the Anglican Creed. And there was complete silence, because Lloyd George had got in touch with all his fellow schoolboys, and they decided that they would make a show of this and not recite the creed. So maybe this was Lloyd George's first political act. Anyway, next slide, please. So, back to Rhuddlan. You can see here that by 1878 there was growing pressure in Rhuddlan for a board school, and a school board with the hopes that it would build a new school. You could only raise the issue every 12 months. If you were voted down, you couldn't raise the issue again for another 12 months. There had been earlier attempts in Rhuddlan to have a school board. Remember, this is 1878 now, and so the Act happened 8 years ago. So in the winter of 1878 into 1879, there were many, many meetings, mainly pro-board, held in Rhyl Town Hall, in the Ragged School in Vale Road, Rhyl, and in the Ebenezer Chapel in Rhuddlan. This is publicising one of them. So this one was held on the 25th of January 1879 at the Ebenezer, and 300 to 400 people attended. The meeting terminated at 9:30 with a vote of thanks to the chairman. Outside there were 2 or 3 schoolboys and one or two drunken men shouting, "No board!" So they had a problem, the pro board had a problem with schoolboys coming into their meetings and disrupting them. Who knows why? Perhaps they didn't want to know any more schools, thank you. So the next slide, please. So, back to Rhuddlan. As I say, the proposal to have a school board had already been voted out once, and this was at least the second attempt. So the arguments for having a school board was that they hoped it would lead to a new school and more funding. It would be non-denominational. Up until then, the school here was national, and a large proportion of the population were non-conformists. They were not happy particularly sending their children to the Anglican school. They hoped it would mean better qualified teachers and a better education. And there were claims that non-conformist children attending the national school were charged more for attendance there than Church of England children. Indeed, at one meeting, Mr. Thomas Evans gave some telling incidences of the inferiority of the education given at Rhuddlan, which for the last 50 years have not even awakened any interest in any child's mind, he said. And no one had ever distinguished himself that had passed through the school. Mr. Robert Hughes referred to the partiality shown at times to the children of churchmen at the expense of non-conformist children. He knew when some children had only to pay a penny a week. At the time, he had had to pay for his own children more than 6pence a week. So I don't know how true that was, but that was how it was put. So those are the pro-board arguments. The anti-board arguments were in support of the status quo. They declared that the school was fit and adequate and doing well, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There was a proportion of the parish that were Anglican and supported an Anglican education. But probably their ace card was the extra cost to the ratepayer if we set up a school board and have a board school in the village. Next slide, please. So, yeah, that's the Ebenezer where the pro-board meetings were held, or some of them. And the next slide, please. So, on the anti-board side, so these are the local people that were against the board. Actually, can we go back a slide? Sorry. And again, another slide. Back one more slide. I haven't actually spoken about the main people supporting the board in Rhuddlan. So the main characters that wanted a school board in Rhuddlan was first and foremost Thomas G. Now Thomas G was an ordained Methodist minister, he was a printer, he was a local politician and proprietor of Welsh language newspapers based in Denby, that's where he was. And he was a very strong voice for setting up school boards and for improving elementary education in Wales, and certainly in North Wales. The other person that was very much for setting up a school board in Rhuddlan was the Reverend John Williams, and that's his picture there, that's the Reverend John Williams there. Now he was a Calvinistic Methodist minister in Rhuddlan, and he was also the owner of the Rhuddlan and Phoenix foundry down by the river. Another strong supporter who would often speak at the pro-board meetings was the Reverend McGregor. Again, he was a non-conformist minister. He was based in Rhyl. Now, these three names, Robert Jones, a labourer from the Gwyndy, Thomas Jones, a labourer from Rhuddlan, and John Davis, labourer based in Rhuddlan, those three men were arrested because of the events of that night in January. And we'll hear more about Robert Jones, Thomas Jones, John Davis in a bit. But also, pro-board was the local paper, the Real Advertiser, which was very much on the liberal side, liberal non-conformist local press. So they were all in support and campaigning to have a school board in Rhuddlan. Sorry. Carry on another two, please. And again. Up, that's it. Oh, no, back one. That one. So, on the other side of the argument, these are the local people that were against having a school board here. So, the first gentleman, John Martin Stanley, Esquire, Crescent Road, Rill. In court, he described himself as an iron founder. He's the reputed owner of Stanley Park. That's how the paper described him, better known at the time as Plas Llewellyn Estate, so that would be in Rill, wouldn't it? Trillewelyn, that sort of area. I'm not sure when he moved here, because previously he was a poor law guardian for the Sheffield Union Workhouse. So at some point he's moved to this area. As I say, he was very much against setting up a board, that he felt the state would be taking the responsibility from the parents more for education if a board was set up. The next person who often spoke at the anti-board meetings was Charles William Bell. Now, he was a solicitor, and his address was given as Spittal. So that's on the outskirts of Rhuddlan, isn't there? There's a big house and a cottage there. I'm not sure where he was. But he was the son of a Mr. William Bell, who was an agent of the Rhuddlan estate. He went to Oxford and entered the legal profession, and he served his articles with Mr. George in Rill. So he was a solicitor that became known throughout the county, advocating in civil and criminal cases. And he would speak at these meetings against the board. Then we have John Fielding of the Board of Commissioners in Rill. So, as far as I can understand, the Board of Commissioners was the forerunner of the Urban District Council. So it was basically, he was on the local authority that administered the Rill from around 1852. Now, also against having a school board was Captain Rowley Conway. And indeed, Captain Rowley Conway from Rhuddlan Estate, he chaired the meeting on that January night. He was chairing the meeting at the National School. Then we've got, I've missed Robert Henry Jones. He was a county court bailiff. He attended that meeting in January as well, against the board. But he says he hadn't made up his mind. He was at that meeting just to find out facts and figures and hear the arguments. So he was undecided whether he was pro-board or anti-board. And then we have Edwin Grattan. Now, it describes Edwin Grattan of being of the New Inn. Now, I don't know if he was proprietor of the New Inn at that time, or whether he was a lodger there, which I presume they have lodgers there as well. But it just describes him as being of the New Inn. And then very much against the board was the Rill Journal. So the two local papers spoke to different constituencies and had very different views on things. And then we have, against the board, assorted small schoolboys. Next slide, please. So this is Rhuddlan in the 1870s. And Right, so this is the new inn. So I'll just outline now what happened exactly on that night in January 1879. And I'll read the report of the court cases. So there was a meeting at the National School. It started at 6:30. It was chaired by Captain Rowley Conway. The speakers were Mr. Stanley, Mr. Fielding, the Reverend Thomas Rowlands, who was the Vicar of Rhuddlan, and Mr. Bell. And about 8 o'clock, after the meeting started, there was an influx of rowdy men in foundry garb. And it was said they came from the chapel prayer meeting, because Mr. Fielding, who was speaking at the time, said, "It's a pity the Reverend John Williams is not here to look after the lambs of his flock." That was after there had been a good deal of disturbance in the meeting and shouting. The Reverend Williams later said that the charge made against him, having concocted the row, was absurd. He always advocated freedom of speech to every man. It was not likely he would now change the practice. Out of 130 workmen employed by him, he had never mentioned the subject of a school board to more than a dozen or so. He understood the great provocation had been given by the speakers. Strangers from Rill, and indeed from England, came there to speak disparagingly. He was sorry that any disturbance had occurred, and he trusted in the future the men of Rhuddlan would try and bear with the insults of unscrupulous men. So Fielding's observation, after the commotion started in the meeting, he said, "Give my compliments to the Reverend John Williams, your master and pastor, and his education did very little credit to his teaching." So he said, "The first reason I said this was they were foundry boys, and I was told on the platform the lads had come from a prayer meeting specially to make a disturbance." So by 9 o'clock the meeting ended uproariously, and by this time there are 80 to 100 people outside the National School. And the speakers were followed to the new inn. There was much shouting of "board, board," and heckling. They were an angry-looking lot, so the speakers went into the new inn for 10 minutes. But the proprietor was a bit worried that this mob would start breaking his windows. So he told them to leave, and to leave by the front door so that the crowd knew they were not on the premises. So the speakers leave the new inn and they head off again, but by now the crowd is throwing stones at them. So they head off, next slide please, and they go to the Black Inn, Black Hotel, which is now the King's Head. It's been demolished and it's on the site of what is now the King's Head. So they take refuge in the Black Inn, which is beginning to sound a little bit like a pub crawl, but never mind. Again, they're allowed there for 10 minutes, and the proprietor is worried about his windows, and he sends them back out the front door again. So in the court case that happened, Peter Jones, a labourer from Rhuddlan, gave evidence. And he said, "I saw Mr. Stanley between the King's Head and the lockup. I saw the defendant, John Davis, in the crowd with a walking stick in his hand. He knocked Mr. Stanley's hat off with it. I only saw the defendant hit him once, and it was only a light tap. There was another in the crowd use his stick, and I saw him hit Mr. Stanley on top of the head with it, but don't know who he was. I caught hold of the stick, and I cautioned the young man. I said to him, 'Don't use that stick anymore, but keep yourself out of the clutches of the law, or I'll use a stick on you.' While I was cautioning this young man, the defendant Davis knocked Mr. Stanley's hat off. I didn't speak to Davis. I remained with Mr. Stanley until he worked his way into the Black Inn yard. The crowd were hooting, as they generally do. I believe they were hooting at Mr. Stanley, and there were about 70 or 80 people. One of the speakers when he went into the new inn, turned round and said, "You Rhuddlan people are more like wild beasts than Christians." A noisy crowd will always give in when anyone speaks a minute. One of the crowd said, "That's why we want the school board to civilise us a bit." As the party entered the Black Inn, Edward Grattan called out that Rhuddlan people were devils and fools. The crowd hooted in reply, and the remark appeared to drive them wild. So James Fielding, in his evidence, said that John Davis had tried to trip him up as he went into the new inn. And he saw another gentleman come in that had been struck with a stone, and he had a dirty place on his coat. As I say, they were frightened that Bob would break the windows, so they agreed to leave the new inn. And the crowd were in a threatening manner. They passed a Black Inn, and the crowd shouted and yelled. And when they were 300 or 400 yards down the real road, I heard a cry of "Murder!" And we turned back and found a man lying in the ditch bottom. Some men were running away, and Mr. R.D. Roberts was trying to raise the man from the bottom of the ditch. The man was R.H. Jones, and he was unconscious. We put him in the conveyance, and we drove about half a mile. Mr. Jones recovered consciousness, and we took him to the Dudley. He managed to walk, but with great pain. We then sent the trap back to Rhuddlan to see what had become of Mr. Stanley. So Robert Henry Jones gives evidence as well. He says he took no part in the meeting, but he was there just to find out. He was undecided if he was pro-board or anti-board. There was a very noisy crowd of 100 people outside the schoolroom, and in passing through them I was hustled from side to side, all the way from the schoolroom to the new inn. There was a tremendous uproar and shouts of "Board" and "No board." Was in the new inn about 8 or 9 minutes, and then there was a large crowd when I left the new inn, and I was similarly treated on the way to the Black Inn, where I remained to shelter myself from the stones that were thrown. The stones struck me many times. I left the Black Inn with Mr. Grattan. Anyway, he leaves and he's kicked by a man, and then another man kicks him, and the last thing he remembers is shouting out for help. And he's the gentleman that is left in the ditch. So feelings were running extremely high, and it ends up in a street brawl, which is not very edifying for anyone, is it really? So the court, it went to court, and it went to the petty sessions at Rhyddlan. And so those three gentlemen were up before the magistrates. Oops. So we've got the two brothers and so Robert Jones, Thomas Jones and John Davis find themselves up in the petty sessions, the petty courts. They come up before the magistrates, and who should the magistrate be? Captain Rowley Conway. So he's disrupted this meeting, he's engaged in a brawl, and now he's up in front of the man who chaired the meeting they disrupted. So the petty sessions hear about the case, and they decide that riot is actually a serious matter, and it's too serious for the petty sessions to decide on, and it's referred to the Quarter Sessions. So the three men are bailed for £50, which sounds quite a lot of money to me, and it goes to the Quarter Sessions. So, next slide, please. So at the Quarter Sessions, the outcome was that the three defendants were found guilty of common assault, and it was decided there was insufficient evidence of riotous intent. Robert Jones was fined £2 and 10 shillings, with £2 10 shillings costs. Thomas Jones was fined £2 including costs, and John Davis was fined 10 shillings with 10 shillings cost. So, next slide, please. So, this is in the local paper. It says the vote. It says school board forever. Vote for a school board. Early next Tuesday. No persecution. School board election. Public meeting of all interested in the school board movement to be held in the town hall mill on Monday next, the 24th of Feb, which is the night before the election on the 25th. So they're still campaigning right up to the last minute. Next slide, please. So the outcome. It says, notes and summary. The school board contest has now ended. After meeting upon meeting for the last 2 months, the town has again shown its side against progress and liberty. The result of the poll was as follows. Against, 633. For, 3-2. Now I think it's worth remembering that the secret ballot had fairly recently just come in, and the secret ballot came in 1872. So people were still getting used to the idea of a secret ballot at that time. And I think the pro-school board people had gone round canvassing and they felt confident that they were going to win. But it didn't go their way. So, next slide, please. So this says, this is the real advertiser for the 1st of March, 1879. School board election. The battle is lost, not by want of enlightenment. The speeches delivered, the articles written, the facts and arguments addressed by the school board advocates were unanswered, if not unanswerable. The information given on the subject in all its bearings could not fail to educate the minds of the people. Every means were employed to bring this knowledge within the reach of every ratepayer. It was shown what the Act of 1870 had done for this country, how the school accommodation had improved and more than doubled. So, what happened? Next slide, please. And to quote Alan this time, it's money, money, money. And this article says, I can't expect you to read it, it's quite small print, it says, the great bugbear, after all, was the rates. Some unscrupulous men had gone about and told the timid ratepayers that the school rate would be from 1 to 2 shillings in the pound. Others had threatened to raise the rents of the small tenements, which frightened the poor people out of their wits. How far this intimidation and undue threat was punishable, we cannot say. So, was this all a storm in a teacup? Just by final word. And I think, no, it brings into sharp focus the debates around this issue that were happening to a greater or lesser degree across the country. And maybe, for reasons I'm not too sure about, they were magnified here, because we didn't get our new school in Rhuddlan until 1935. So I'm not sure why, whether we were more equally balanced Anglican non-conformists, that it blocked anything further happening. But I would also say that it points perhaps to a raised awareness of the Welsh identity, of ideas of Welsh consciousness and nationalism. Because if you go on a few years from this date, you have the start of the tithe wars, which is a whole different subject. And I'm going to stop there. Okay, thank you.
Anybody would like to ask?
There's not much to see, but if you go through the archives, they talk about the national school being the boys' school, and that there was another school on the map you can see, and that's the one we went to, and that became the infants and girls' school and children. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. So, you can see in the archives, you can see mentioned of that school. This one, the national school, this
Somebody reliving their childhood, you see. This is fair. Again, thank you, Julie. Are there any questions that anybody would like?
I'm interested. It seems that the elite, the landowners, the aristocracy, the monarchy, didn't want education of the lower orders. I mean, put in the novel terms, Lady Rhuddlan in the novel Cranford didn't want to employ a girl who could read and write and knew her figures, because they saw the educated masses as knowing what was going on and wanting a share of it.
I think it's very difficult because the Anglican Church, rightly or wrongly, like it or not like it, is linked to the landlords. And if you look at Thomas G, a bit before this period in Gethley Vor, he can't even get land to build a British school on because the landowners are Anglican. So they're even struggling to get access to land to build a school on, even if they've got the funds to build a school. So it gets very, doesn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
You mentioned just then at the end of the talk how the Rhuddlan riots sort of created a lot more of awareness about Welsh nationalism. How significant do you think that awareness of Welsh nationalism really became because of the Rhuddlan riots?
I think that's difficult. I think it's not one thing, is it? I think you've got Thomas G with his Welsh language newspaper in Denbigh, right across North Wales, and he was very prominent in the tide wars that came. And I think this issue really highlights the clash of cultures here between the non-conformists that want this school board and are talking about it in their, prayer groups and in their workplace, and then the other side, the Anglican side, that is perhaps a break on it and is worried about the money side, the rates going up, and they're pushing that down. I don't think it's any one thing. I think the whole it's another little illustration of that rising awareness.
Excuse me, but the Blue Book did have a big effect on the way the people thought about themselves in Wales. Because it was very derogatory. Yeah,
it was. It wasn't just on education, was it? It was very criticising the way of life, the morals, and it was just very unsympathetic and partisan.
History, can you tell us how the Welsh Not, the terrible Welsh Not for school children, how does it fit in date-wise?
I have a problem with this because I have read that the 1870 Act was actually doing the Welsh language a disservice. That this comes in, you have school boards, you have inspectors, you have everything, and at that point the Welsh language slides down because it's English. And what fascinates me is that this pro-school movement in Rhuddlan is many of the reports in the papers, which to my shame I'm not very good at Welsh and can't read, but many of the speakers at the pro board meetings are speaking in Welsh, and they're reported in Welsh in the papers. So this seems to be an unintended consequence. Every policy out there has intended and unintended consequences, doesn't it? So I struggle to answer that question. I'm not sure, I would say to that.
Can I just say, my father remembers the Welsh, or remembered when he was alive, the Welsh not.
Right.
And he was punished if he spoke Welsh
Yeah.
to his brothers and sisters in school. And
It's-
that coloured his life forever.
It would put you off school for life, wouldn't it?
Makes me ashamed to be English.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So it's a good point, and I'm not sure what the answer is to that one.
Well, if there are no more questions, I'd just like to thank Julie again for making that long trip all the way down Parliament Street to be with us tonight. It must be one of the most local speakers we've ever had. You probably walked. Yes, I thought you might. It really wasn't worth getting the car out. When Julie was talking about children attending school, it reminded me of my school days because, yes, I did go to school. Very rural area that I was brought up in, and every September there were 3 or 4 children in the class that were always missing, and it was either measles, mumps, chicken pox, one of the usual diseases, but they never had any of these diseases because they all came from a farming community.
Yes.
So they were helping getting the harvest in or whatever. So it's you know, I mean, in my lifetime I've seen that happen.
Yeah.
But there we are. We've all got stories that we can tell along those lines. But anyway, thank you all for coming tonight, continuing to support us in our onward move to find a permanent residence. And I think after the turnout tonight, if you're all happy here, then we'll try and make this our permanent home. We've moved around quite a bit. So thank you all for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Ted and Barry for eventually getting the equipment working. I know they had a few problems. Rock on, as they say. And finally, Hayden, he's got raffle tickets. You might win something.
That happened on its own, picked the right time.
361, 365. Thank you. Peach, if you can go help yourself to it. Thank you. Thank you. Just throw one out of here.